Your title, okay. How do you pronounce it?
Title?
You mean the surname?
Oh, Delventhal.
Delventhal.
Yes.
A very good evening to one and all present. Welcome to PDM Talk number 8. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Willem Delventhal. He's a game designer and a business founder who specializes in UGC and EdTech. He also happens to daylight as a purple wizard, helping people break into gaming industry. William is on an eternal quest to create a world in which all game developers can financially support themselves by making games. He loves working on games in unusual exploratory spaces, including a friendship-first metaverse, scientific games for cats, and an AR dungeon crawling board game where an app acts as your dungeon master. So we are happy to have you, sir, and looking forward to learning a lot from you.
All right. Can you guys hear me? All good? All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Willem, and I'm here. I was invited to come speak at IIIT Hyderabad. I'm so excited to be here. This is a very cool opportunity for me. I'm grateful for welcoming me into this space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about game design. So you can see the talk up here is how to design a compelling video game. I understand that many of you are in product design, in the design space, or in product of some form or another. Game design is the product designer of the video game industry. And fundamentally, what we do is try to figure out how to make an experience, an interactable event, fun for our players. Now, you already got the introduction to who I am, but that's also me. I've been a game designer in the video game industry, mostly in the United States, for a little over 10 years now. And about 4 years ago, I founded the Indie Game Academy, which is an online school for game developers. Basically, we help people make games. Right now, I am the design director at a company called Mod Collective. If you're familiar with the term mod, that basically is a piece of UGC that is generally created by the community for a specific video game. We make premium mods at Mod Collective. This is some of the stuff I've worked on. Typically, I work on educational games and UGC-heavy games, and I work on a lot of them. Okay, so there's a fundamental problem in game development, which is that games are really hard. It is what we call a boom and bust industry, which means typically you make a lot of money or you make nothing. And those who make a lot are very few and far between. Only about 30% of indie games on Steam make over $10,000 USD. And only 7% of games at large generate enough revenue to fund a second project. So that means 93% of games are failing. And really 7%, the ones that do succeed and make enough money to justify a second game, that doesn't mean that they actually turn a profit. That means they make enough to justify a second game. It is truly a boom and bust industry. So a game designer is one of the people who are trying to mitigate risk, are trying to lower the risk of a game concept, mostly by making a game actually fun. That's our job, trying to figure out how to make something that is actually fascinating and good for our players. Now, there are so many different roles that work together to create a game. I'm a little bit biased because I work in games, but games are truly one of the most complicated tech creations that there are. It takes so much effort to make a video game. In general, the average video game, especially if we're talking from those AAA companies like a Blizzard or an Activision, takes anywhere between 3 and 7 years to create and costs $200 to $500 million USD to produce. And even if we're talking on the even if we're talking on the indie side, which is those small creators, that's usually anywhere between 6 months and 2 years to make an indie game. And often, they still have million-dollar budgets for those games. It takes a lot to make a game, and a lot of people contribute to it. These are the sort of 9 primary categories, though, of what people do in the game industry, and I am a designer. And we're going to talk a little bit about what designers actually do in the game industry, and then I'm going to give you some fundamentals of how design actually works. So, game design is largely the study of human motivation. Game players don't have to play games. And yet, on average, we spend 7 hours a week playing our games. That is, by the way, more time than we spend cleaning ourselves. We spend more time playing games than we do actually taking care of our bodies. Game designers are the ones designing gameplay with the intent of specific emotional deliverables. So usually we're trying to get our players to feel a certain way. And then everything that comes from, everything that we actually design is to follow along with that objective, is to try to get our players to feel one particular way. They are often beholden to product, so product is usually the one saying, here's the objective, and then designers are the one trying to figure out how to fulfill that objective via those emotional deliverables. A game designer is typically responsible for coming up with systems and mechanics. A mechanic is a single input and output from our player. So a very simple example might be, I press the space bar and my character jumps. That's a mechanic. A system is a collection of mechanics. So I might have a farming system that allows me to have farming gameplay in my game that is made up of many individual mechanics. They create a lot of documentation. We do a lot of writing as designers. They also are usually the player evangelists. Basically, we're the ones who argue for the player's point of view. Product says, we need to make more money. And designers say, yes, but the player doesn't care. They wind up something like a project manager as well, too, because after we design our games, we then are sort of responsible for making sure people actually stick about the game industry is that we're still quite young, actually. You guys probably know that better than I do because it's even younger in India. Some of those people who really created the game industry, like defined those genres that we use now to design games, are still alive making games right now. And as a result, a lot of what I'm going to tell you is up in the air, is still not very well defined. But some of those roles that you might run into are level designers, the people creating the maps and layouts for our games, systems designers, which is what I typically do. Those are the people who are doing the more mechanical side of it. How does the game actually function? Content designers who are making pieces of a game, so they might make cool outfits or cool weapons for a game. Technical designers who are halfway between an engineer and a designer, and seriously, so many more. Design is typically one department in the overall game company, in the overall studio. And typically they are either led by a creative director, a design director, or actually product. Sometimes a producer will be the person who leads the entire design team. A huge part of our job is what we call design writing, which more or less means we're writing out how the game should actually play. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about design writing, sort of the DNA of how a game actually gets made. Has anybody heard of the term GDD in game design before? What's a GDD? Yes, and what is it? Yes, exactly that. Our GDD is something like a business plan or the definition of how the game is actually going to play. And it typically is a one document with a bunch of different parts to it. So we might have a section of our GDD that's about our combat. We might have a section of our GDD that's about the economy of our game, how we'll actually purchase things and earn things in our game. So it defines exactly what the game is that we are building. They are primarily meant to keep the team on the same page. For those of you who haven't made a game before, it is remarkably similar to herding cats. It is amazing how you can all agree on one thing and then all build something completely different. And that is a huge part of why we design right. We're trying to, as clearly as possible, define what the game needs to be so that everybody is making the same game. It helps to surface unanswered questions quickly as well. So we might write our GDD and then the animator is like, wait, we haven't defined any of our animations yet. So we know we have to have that conversation. And it acts as a reference for all team members as they start building their game. So I'm going to start by showing you an old GDD from many years ago that gives you a good sort of example of what GDDs used to be like and still kind of are like. Does anybody know the game Grim Fandango? It's an older game. It was extremely popular in the 90s, and it was recently re-released. So I'm going to pull up the actual GDD from this game now. All right. So GDDs used to be gigantic documents, 72 pages long. Gigantic documents that defined every little part of the game. Here is the location layout of year one in Grim Fandango. It tells you that there's a roof with a ledge on it. And behind, if you go down from that ledge, you can find behind the office. And from there, you might get out onto the street. So it actually defines the states of our map layout and how we can move around the level. But there's all kinds of other things in here, including what are the different puzzles we might run into in this game, and how exactly do they play out, and how exactly does the player actually complete them. It includes all sorts of other things, though. You can see Grim Fandango is super puzzle heavy. And really, the whole point of this thing, here's a cutscene that they have defined for you. Even though there's no visual elements yet, it defines what the cutscene will eventually look like. So once again, the whole purpose of a GDD is to say, here's how the game is going to look, everybody. Now we can all agree. This actually doesn't get used that much anymore. Can anybody guess why these giant documents aren't used as commonly anymore? Isn't scalable. That's an interesting one. Can you tell me more what you mean? Yeah. Yeah, it takes a lot of work. Yeah, that's probably, I don't know, months of work? That's a lot of work just to make a text document before you actually have to build the game. That's true. But actually, the biggest reason that we don't use these anymore is because nobody reads them. I'm not going to read 72 pages before I get to work. Oh, my God. So instead, what we often build these days is a little bit more simple. So I'm going to show you a very simplified GDD that I made for some of my work at Mod Collective. We're working, does anybody know the game Baldur's Gate 3? Okay, so Baldur's Gate 3 is a narrative adventure game, similar to like Dungeons & Dragons or something like that, where we're going on an adventure. It's a fantasy world like Lord of the Rings or something along those lines. And we're building mods for that fantasy world. Once again, a mod is a piece of UGC, an actual extra piece of content that you are able to play in this world. So a mod might just be a new outfit that has been added to the game, or what we're doing is actual gameplay. We're creating brand new quest lines for Baldur's Gate 3. So this is a what we call a wiki GDD, which is just a wiki, with the same content of that GDD, but generally much simpler. We're always aiming for just enough information that we can all agree on what we're building, but not too dense where it winds up, that nobody will ever actually read it. So we're building a quest line. This is an example of one called A Taste of a Certain Court. That's like this vampire adventure. You have to go chase down this vampire. And it includes all kinds of different sections to it. So it includes, for instance, our gameplay pillars, which we're going to talk about in a moment. This is how we define our emotional objectives. This quest line should make you feel like there's a wider world out there. It should make you feel like you've been given a just reward for your quest. It should make you feel like it's the start of something more. More is going to come from this quest. It includes all kinds of other things, though, including just some business objectives and the actual mod pack list, what's going to be included in this mod. And then, most importantly, though, it includes how the game will actually play. So here's our quest design. This is the map of Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3 and the exact locations of the interactable moments that you'll run into in our little quest line, as well as some definitions of how they will actually play. You're going to run into this crazy goblin who's ranting about being attacked by a vampire up in the middle of Act 1. It also includes some elements like combat design. Here's how the fight will actually play out. You're going to get surrounded by some zombies. It's going to be super fun and awesome. And part of the reason we do a wiki is because it's much more easily navigatable. So instead of having to go through 70 pages, if I am somebody who's working on the combat, I just go click on combat design, and I don't need to read the rest of the GDD. I don't care about that. All right. Now, by the way, I'm going to do a quick self-promo here. We work with juniors at Mod Collective to contribute small pieces to our mod packs. So I'll share this out for anyone who's interested later. But we do basically allow people to contribute small parts to our mod if anybody is ever interested in doing so. I'll leave it up for like 20 seconds. All right. So let's talk about core design, defining how your game should actually feel. Does anybody know what a player fantasy is? Has anybody heard of this term before? Good, perfect. That means I can tell you. So a player fantasy is the feeling or dream a player is trying to fulfill by playing their game, by playing this game. Universally, more or less, 100% or 90 to 100% of games have a fantasy that the player is trying to fulfill by playing it. So let's do some simple ones first. Does anybody know the game Stardew Valley? What is the player fantasy of Stardew Valley? Yeah, let's. Uh-huh. Not quite. So Stardew Valley is a farming simulator. It's one of the original cozy games. Basically, it's a really calming, it's a very calming, relaxed piece of gameplay. And more or less all you do is farm. So the player fantasy of Stardew Valley is to have a relaxing time in the countryside where all you have to do is farm, and you don't have to be a part of all the craziness of day-to-day life. Does anybody know Metroid Prime, the Metroid series? Chosen some terrible examples here, apparently. All right, so Metroid Prime is a popular game from the GameCube where you are a bounty hunter and you chase down aliens. So the player fantasy of Metroid Prime is to be an alien hunting, kick-butt person, is to be like super powerful, right? Versus Angry Birds. Do we know what Angry Birds is? All right, what is the player fantasy of Angry Birds? This is the hardest one. Anybody have a good guess? Break everything? Not bad. Yeah, I would say the player fantasy of Angry Birds is to destroy my enemies. Yeah, I play Angry Birds to destroy those dang pigs, right? And I can probably visualize that somebody I really don't like is one of those pigs. Okay, so I have shamelessly stolen some content from other smart people, including David Bennett, who's a friend of mine. He used to be a senior game designer at Blizzard. He's also a past professor from the Indie Game Academy. So that link will take you to his LinkedIn. I encourage you to connect with him and ask him questions as well. So David is actually the person who first introduced me to the concept of gameplay pillars, which now are like a ubiquitous form of game design. This is something that more or less everybody does when they're first coming up with game concepts or even features for their concepts. A gameplay pillar, also sometimes called game pillars, also sometimes called design pillars, are typically 3 statements that act as the core emotional objective for the project. Once again, what designers do is they give us emotional objectives. We're trying to make the player feel a certain way. So the gameplay pillars are declarative statements that help us put our finger on what those emotional objectives are. They are foundational truths that guide all aspects of development. And they are typically short and snappy. So Until You Fall is a VR title that David worked on that was released a couple of years ago by Shell Games. In the VR title Until You Fall, their primary gameplay pillar is become a sword god. That's the gameplay pillar. And you can already feel how that really themes what the game should feel like. So this gameplay pillar has a lot of implications for how we might move through production. So I would love to hear some examples. How would Become a Sword God affect the gameplay of a VR title? Don't be shy. Yeah, you better have a sword in the game, right, if you're going to become a sword god. Anything for art? What would Become a Sword God imply about the art of this game? Yeah, I like that. Yeah, if we're going to have gods, we've got some kind of pantheon, and if we have some kind of pantheon, it's going to immediately feel like a fantastical fantasy world, for sure. Anything else? How about for the sound? How would Become a Sword God affect the sound of our game? Yeah, okay. Mystical. I also would just argue Become a Sword God. If you're a god, it's all going to be big, powerful, intense, crazy. You're not going to be like politely fencing. You're going to be crushing things, getting giant explosions, stuff like that. So you can see how intense the combat is in Until You Fall and why Become a Sword God was a powerful gameplay pillar for them. So when designing gameplay pillars, and we're actually going to do this in a second together. I'm going to make you we're going to come up with a game concept together in just a second. You're going to start by asking yourself what the player actually does moment to moment. What is the activity that happens in this game, the input and output that happens in this game? You'll then decide on the goals and the moments you want your player to experience. What actually is happening in this game, and what are the things that I don't want my player to forget? What are the unique moments that I want to deliver with this game? You'll then make 2 to 4 declarative statements that are your pillars. Become a Sword God is an example of one of them. At Shell Games, they then like to make what they call propaganda posters about each pillar, which are basically just visual representations of those gameplay pillars so that they can literally put them up on the wall and then they don't forget about their gameplay pillars. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples. The first one is actually from a student game called Meteor Down. It was featured on Steam Next Fest, and it's basically like a deck building game with a 2D turn-based element to it. So you actually have characters that you're playing from your deck that walk around the screen and fight each other. And they have these as their 3 gameplay pillars and the propaganda posters for those pillars. One of them is unlock your inner alien-killing badass. You know, that has a lot to say about how the game should feel, right? The second is feel like a tactical genius. Once again, that themes a lot of how the game will actually play. And then the third is emotions are power. In this world, in this game, the way that magic or something equivalent to magic happens is your emotions actually cause them. So all 3 of those are going to make some pretty significant changes to how the game plays and how the game is designed. Let's use some more well-known examples. Do people know Zelda Breath of the Wild? Awesome. All right. So in Zelda Breath of the Wild, it is the first, or at least the first in a very long time, open-world Zelda game, and it was one of their most successful Zelda games in a very long time. And I'm gonna preface this by saying I don't know their actual gameplay pillars. They didn't release that information, and I don't even know if they used gameplay pillars, but I'm going to guess at what they actually were. I would love for some of you, knowing what Zelda Breath of the Wild is, to give your guess as to what Zelda Breath of the Wild's gameplay pillars might be. Anybody have an idea? Yes, absolutely. That's a good start. So I will reveal them now. Very fancy technology. All right. Oh, that didn't work at all. Hold on. Is that not it? Well, we can read it there. You can't quite read it. Hold on here. There we go. Okay. So once again, I don't know their actual gameplay pillars. This is not information they released, but this is my best guess at what the 3 pillars would be for Zelda Breath of the Wild. I would argue that number 1 is freedom of movement. Zelda Breath of the Wild gave us far more mechanics that allow us to traverse the world in interesting and effective ways than any other Zelda game before. If you've played the game, you know that the glider, the hang glider, is one of the big elements that got introduced in Breath of the Wild. You're able to jump off of literally any height and survive because you can glide down to the ground. So freedom of movement was a big part of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The second one, and this is something that they've talked about, is to solve problems your own way. They give you a number of tools in Zelda Breath of the Wild that allow you to solve basically any problem in an infinite number of ways. In previous Zelda games, there are very hard, very specific puzzles that must be solved in a very specific way. In Breath of the Wild, they don't care. You do it your way. If you want to solve the problem by blowing it up with bombs, great. I don't care, as long as you enjoy it. And the third one I would say is scavenge for what you need. They introduced a fairly controversial mechanic in this game where the weapons that you pick up, as well as some of the equipment, can break if you use it too much, and there's no way to fix it. So you are constantly changing which equipment you have because it's constantly breaking. And as a result, you must always scavenge, which actually helps to reinforce that second pillar of solve problems your own way, because you're forced to solve problems a different way because your gear is constantly changing. So I'll do one more example here. This is Crypt of the Necro Dancer. This is a really interesting rhythm-based game. It's a puzzle-solving, a sort of puzzle-like adventure game where you are moving through a dungeon and you must move through this dungeon to a beat. You actually have to play the game to a rhythm. And it's a beloved game. It actually wound up having a sequel that was a Zelda game, which is kind of fascinating. And I have our 3 gameplay pillars for this here as well. I'll just jump right into them. So obviously, the first mechanic, the first pillar, is to play to the beat. The most important thing, the thing that is unique about this game is that you are playing the game to a beat, you are playing the game rhythmically, musically. The second part of the game is that there are constant, similar to Zelda, constant changes to which weapons and equipment you're using to actually fight. So way too many weapons, I would argue, is one of those pillars. And then finally, I would say never before seen enemies is perhaps one of their pillars. Because of this rhythm training game, the enemies behave in very interesting ways that no other dungeon crawler quite ever delivered before. And as a result, I, as a player, am forced to figure out how to overcome these enemies in a way that I never have before as well. So we're actually going to come up with some gameplay pillars now. We're going to design a narrative adventure game. We've been prompted to come up with the game's player fantasy, and then the gameplay pillars for this game. So let's actually brainstorm together. This is a narrative adventure game, which means we're going out on some kind of adventure. We're going out to solve some problem, some sort of MacGuffin. Can anybody give me a good player fantasy? What are we trying to fulfill on this adventure? And in this case, there are no wrong answers. Be brave, give me something. I don't want to have to come up with it myself. I will pick on someone. I met you earlier. Give me a player fantasy. Planet Finder? Okay, yeah. Let's see. I'm gonna be a designer and embellish it more. So I'm gonna call the player fantasy the joy of finding a new place, discovering a new place. I'm going out on an adventure to discover something new. So that means the adventure is not about battling. The adventure is not about beating Ganondorf. The adventure is not about fighting. The adventure is instead about discovering. And that alone themes the game pretty differently, right? Okay, so that's our player fantasy. That's the fantasy we're trying to get our players to fulfill. Why don't we throw out some gameplay pillars for it? What are some elements to this exploration game that we could add? We've got a couple of examples here, right? Freedom of movement, solve problems your own way. Think about that game. If we're going out and finding new planets, how about this? Let's start with mechanics. What actually happens in the game? Speak a little louder for me. Movements? Sure? Yeah? Yeah. There's a game design sort of fundamentals rule called the 90-10 rule, which basically means you steal 90% of your mechanics from other people, and only 10% is innovation. So I love it. Freedom of movement is a great gameplay pillar. So maybe our rocket can truly go anywhere. Maybe once we actually land on the planet, oh, I've spelled everything incorrectly. Once we actually land on the planet, perhaps we have a jetpack or other mechanics like that that help us have this freedom of movement, this sense of freedom of movement. What about some others? What else could we include in this game? Ooh, I love that, yes. Novel ecosystems. So every time we land somewhere new, this is starting to feel like No Man's Sky. Every time we land somewhere new, we're going to find something new. Maybe we have procedurally generated plants and animals. The world truly feels new every time I land. Can we get one more? Ooh. Yeah, rather than just going immediately there. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to say that. Maybe like cartographers, I don't even know how to spell that. Cartographers prep work or something like that? I don't know. We can workshop it later. We're just going to send this to corporate and they'll tell us what they think. Yeah, so maybe there's a lot of prep work involved in actually heading to these planets. Maybe we only have so much fuel, and if we aren't careful about charting our course, we might get lost out in space or something like that. So you can see that just from these 4 statements, we now kind of have a whole game. We know generally at least how the game is going to feel. And as a result, anytime we make a choice from now on, we can refer back to these statements and we can say, well, does it make sense to even have combat in this game? Let me actually ask you, does it make sense to have combat in this game? The joy of discovering a new place, and then these are our pillars. What do you think? Could work. Tell me what combat in this game might be like. Say that again? Who said that? Fighting aliens? Yes, yeah. Aliens are in space and we could go and fight them. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, think about like the famous explorers of the past. Yeah, they aren't really known because they went and fought a lion. They're known because they discovered something new. Maybe they found, a volcano or some island or something like that. And maybe there were lions on that island and they had to deal with it, but it's not really what it was about. So there might be combat in this game, yes, but probably it's lighthearted or simplified or just not that common. It's more about the exploration and the joy of discovery. Okay, So now we're actually going to design the game. Now we have our emotional objectives. Now we know how the game should feel. And now we're going to design it for reals. So I'm once again going to shamelessly steal somebody else's work. We love doing that in games. This is Quinn Elmer. He's the lead narrative designer at Lost Boys Interactive. Lost Boys is known basically for contributing to AAA titles. So they most recently contributed to Diablo 4, and he's their lead narrative designer. He has this really fascinating thing that he calls the storytelling framework, which is a way of creating narrative beats in your game. So here's a moment that happens that the player will never forget. Here's the next one. Here's the next one. Now, I'm going to step here into the world of narrative design, which is another one of those subcategories of game design. And for the most part, these are the people who are telling the story, who are deciding how the story should actually progress. Halfway between narrative, storytelling, and design is what we call a narrative designer. This person is sort of few and far between. Different companies have different numbers of narrative designer, or some just don't have one and they just call them game designers. Different game companies can work different ways. But for the most part, if you do have a narrative designer, their job is something akin to design, where they are creating those core emotional deliverables, but they're doing it via narrative, via storytelling. So if we have a game, we've got this space adventure where we're going out and discovering, there are different actual systems and mechanics that we can interact with. So perhaps we can talk to an NPC. An NPC is a non-player controlled, basically a character that's in the world. Maybe we can talk to other characters, right? We can travel to quest locations, for sure. We definitely have that in our space adventure game. We maybe can investigate an area. That could take a couple of different forms. And we maybe can fight some enemies. We've decided probably not as much fighting, but maybe a little bit of fighting. There's all kinds of different gameplay verbs that we could have in our game, and these can act as different ways for us to actually engage and play the game. So Quinn likes to describe his mechanics via verb. So he only adds elements to his game that he can describe as an understandable verb to his players. That's basically so that he has an easy way to design it. So we might traverse, we might talk, we might sneak, we might fight, observe, investigate, or solve. Now we can use beat cards, he calls them, to talk about story and gameplay as one element. There's sort of a problem that he is pointing to here, trying to solve with this talk, where narrative, the people telling the story, and gameplay, the people coming up with those mechanics, can sometimes be disparate and not actually work together, and therefore you have a bit of a disjointed game. So his argument is that you should be adding these two different things, the gameplay as well as the narrative, into just one location, these beat cards, he calls them. So a single beat card has a verb in the top left. It might be talk, investigate, fight, explore. It then has a name, just so that we know what it is, as well as a location in your world. So maybe it's a planet that we're going to explore. Maybe it's a single location on that planet. An emotion that we're trying to deliver with that beat, and then the actual content, the actual happening of that beat. So for example, maybe we have a farm that you can go explore. And on that farm, there is an NPC that I'm able to talk to. So my verb is talk. The emotion that the player should feel when they talk to this character is inquisitive. They should be like, all right, what is this guy doing? I'm going to go talk to them and find out. And then we, of course, have what actually happens in the game. So in this case, the player talks to an NPC who asks them to help find some missing chickens. I don't know if this would be in our space adventure, but maybe there's space chickens. The player can ask a few questions and is eventually told to start searching in the woods. So this acts as a sort of like stopgap to the next beat. It directs you to the next beat. It helps you figure out where the next beat actually happens. And then once we have one of these beats designed, we can design multiple using multiple different verbs, and we can string together how our game should actually play. So in his example here, he's got some dialogue. We talk to somebody, then we traverse, we go explore, we walk around basically. We wind up in a combat, we found some of those space lions, then we solve some sort of puzzle, and then we have another dialogue. Maybe we go back to that NPC and we say, I found your chickens, or whatever. And that actually is how we wind up building our game and defining those core beats of how the game will actually play. Okay, so we are going to kind of do this together again. Congratulations. All of you just got hired as narrative designers. Wow. The game has gotten approved by leadership. Wow, that was the fastest approval process I've ever seen. It's time to design the game. Now, I have dramatically simplified this talk to give you some idea of what designers actually do in the game industry. So this is like less than 1% of what we actually put together when we're designing a game. But it gives you some sense of what we do and how we actually operate. So what we're going to do is we're going to make 3 little baby beats. And each of those beats is going to be kind of like our Act 1, 2, and 3 of our story in this space adventure game. Now before we even do that, I want us to go back to our player fantasy and our gameplay pillars. Remember that the only way that those tools are useful is if we consistently refer to them. And before we make decisions, we make sure we're in the right headspace and the right emotional space. So let's remember, the player fantasy that we're trying to fulfill is the joy of discovering a new place. So for all of you, I'm sure at least you've had a thought like, oh man, it'd be so cool to go to this place one day and really discover it, find it, hang out with it. That's what we're trying to make our player feel. That's the fantasy we're trying to fulfill. And then the actual gameplay pillars that we're trying to hit with this are freedom of movement. We want the player to feel free to express, to move, to locomote. We want to have novel ecosystems, and we want to have prep work involved to actually get there. So then, now that we have that in mind, let's design a little baby game with 3 little beats. So our Act 1 needs to be 1 beat. I'll pull this up to give you some ideas. How should we start? Let's pick 1 verb. How should we start? The player starts this game. What's the first thing we should do? Pick 1 verb for me. Investigate? I'm hearing investigate from a lot of people. Anyone argue that it's not investigate? Traverse? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to argue that it's investigate, and I'll tell you why. One of the things that we mentioned here is prep work. We don't just go off on the adventure. We got to make sure that we're ready to go off on the adventure, right? And so I think that investigate, or maybe a similar verb that's not quite the same thing as investigate, maybe just prep even, is the verb we would actually do at the beginning. We wouldn't just immediately leave. We wouldn't just immediately traverse. We would spend a moment to make sure we're ready to traverse. So we'll use investigate to stick to his framework, but remember that designers make up all kinds of crazy stuff as long as it works and everybody agrees what it means. So we're going to call this an investigate type. Can you guys see that okay? Okay. Oh, I can't edit it when it's in full screen. That's good. Well, let's see. Can I do this? Let's do that. All right. So our first beat is to investigate. Where should this actually happen? Could be observe. 1 is because we're only doing 3 beats here, which is sort of comically short. It would never be only 3 beats. But if we did observe, then perhaps we've learned a little bit less. Investigate actually is an active verb. We're doing something. But honestly, it could be either. There's no reason it can't be observe. All right, so where should our investigation happen in Act 1 of our brilliant space game? A spaceship? Okay. Are we investigating the spaceship maybe? Something like that? Okay, yeah. All right, so we're in our spaceship. All right. And what emotion are we trying to get the player to feel during our investigation? Curiosity? All right, we'll do curiosity. Curiosity. I don't like spelling in front of all of you. It makes me self-conscious. All right. All right, so what actually happens? How does it play? Just describe it to me. We don't need to get too intense about it. I'm on my spaceship. I'm supposed to feel curious, and I'm investigating something. What actually happens?
Probably low on energy or fuel, and then trying to investigate the nearest source.
Yeah, okay. So maybe the player checks their various gauges, and balances, like mission needs versus what they have. Something like that, maybe? Cool. Anything else?
Just to enhance, you could show a large planet through the glass of the spaceship.
Ooh, yeah.
And through some drones, you can show close-ups of the planet.
Ooh, I love that. All right. The next planet is visible through a viewport, and close-ups of that planet are visible in various displays. Awesome. All right, I'm going to call that good for beat 1, but look at that. You guys are starting to have a pretty good idea of how this game plays, right? Yeah. I kind of like this already. I'm sitting in a spaceship. I'm looking at various gauges. I'm turning around. I'm checking how much fuel I have. I'm looking at the planet. I'm like, that looks pretty cool. I'm getting curious. Okay, Act 2. What now? Let's go back to our verbs. We've investigated. What next? Yeah. Traverse? Okay. Anybody disagree? One of the... Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting argument. One of the really fun and awful things about game design is that there's no right answers. So it could be either. Why don't we do a little vote? Who wants it to be traverse? Okay. Who wants it to be solve? All right, we're going to go with traverse. So now that choice alone says something about who this game is for, which, by the way, we would have defined who the game is for before doing any of this. So we don't normally design a game and then figure out who it's for. We usually know who we're targeting, and we design for that type of person, right? But the fact that we're traversing instead of solving says something about who this game is for, and what it really says is that this is for a more soft-core audience. It's for somebody who's playing for a more casual reason. It's for somebody who's playing for a more sort of cozy, like nice reason. Solving implies a lot more work, which might be somebody who is more into that kind of thing, is more advanced than somebody who just wants to have like a cool space adventure. All right, I like the traverse. So this is now our second act. All right, where does this happen? Okay, yeah, open space. Ooh. And what emotion should the player feel? Say that again? Determination? All right. Determined. Ooh, okay. Determined and a little scared. Love it. All right. So what actually happens? Okay. I'll just call it obstacles and avoid them. Anything else? Anything else happen on my traverse to this cool planet? Ooh. Yeah. Okay, what's kind of cool, or I'll pull it up in a second actually. The player chooses their path on which to embark. Anything else? Nice. All right. All right. So once again, we've gotten closer to understanding how this game is going to work, feel, and play. Now the player chooses a path on which they want to embark. Perhaps there's a couple of space highways or something. They fly through some obstacles and avoid them, or perhaps there's more than just avoid. It's always good to give player autonomy, player choice. So if the only choice is to avoid them, might become repetitive. And the spaceship responds to the ecosystem. We can actually feel it rocking and shaking and like, oh man, we're going through an asteroid belt. Just to pull it up, because we're kind of accidentally making this game. This is an indie game from a pretty good amount of time ago now. It's called Faster Than Light. And there we go. And one of the things they do is they have multiple choice space adventures. So you can choose which path to go down, and different things happen to you depending on those paths. So we just accidentally invented the map traversal of Faster Than Light. Good job, everybody. All right, Act 3. We've gone on traverse. We've investigated. What happens in the final act of our game? Observe. Okay. Any other arguments? Talk. Okay. All right. We might talk. Investigate again, maybe. Yeah. We can only do the same action again. Sneak into the planet. Nice. Okay. Interesting. All right. Let's do. So I'm going to strike sneak. Brilliant idea. But I would argue. This is one of the reasons we come up with gameplay pillars, because something that you'll find is that game developers are artists and artists are trouble. artists like to argue about the best way to do art. So one of the reasons that we have gameplay pillars is so that we can point back to them when we get into arguments and say, but that doesn't work with our gameplay pillar, so we shouldn't do that. So I would say for sneaking, our game is about freedom of movement. And sneaking is pretty defined. And so if we want it to be open and expressive, we probably would not have sneaking, right? But I think we could have observe or investigate. I think we could have talk. And I think we could have investigate. So why don't we'll do a three-way vote. We're going to vote between talk, observe, and investigate. Who thinks it should be investigate? 3. Who thinks it should be observe? 2. Who thinks it should be talk? Okay, interesting. Somebody volunteer why you think it should be talk. Okay. Yeah. Nice. Okay. That's interesting. So couldn't you get the same information from observe? Does it have to be talk? Yeah, you could. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to go with talk because you guys voted for it. But I, as a designer, would actually push back on talk. Because this game is not about talking to people. This game is about the fantasy of discovering a new place. And we do talk to people in new places, for sure. But I personally, when I try to put myself in that place of feeling, discovering a new place is about me. I'm the one discovering it. Somebody isn't telling me about it. I'm discovering it. So I would argue that it's observe, but we'll go with talk. All right. Once again, there's no wrong answers. It's just about what kind of game we're building. So we're going to do a talk. Where does this happen? On the planet's surface. I'd love to get more specific than that. Where does it happen? Yeah, okay. Why don't we do, I like choices that theme the game. So why don't we call it like the headquarters? It's like the Capitol, the Capitol building, yeah. If people have played the Spore games, maybe it's similar to Spore, where there's a couple of cities like placed around the planet. And so I go and I land at the Capitol building and I go and talk to the mayor or whoever the heck. What emotion should the player feel while talking to this person? Inquisitive, okay, yeah. Any other takes? Excited? Yeah, actually, let's go with excited. It's a third act. We want it to be big. All right. What happens? The player talks to somebody at the Capitol building. Why don't we define who that is, because that would help. Who are we talking to? The mayor of the, actually, yeah, it should be probably bigger than that, the president. There you go. It's the president of the whole dang planet. What happens? Ooh, okay. The president presents the explorer with a desperate plea. Anything else? I spelled desperate wrong. Anything else? Okay, yeah. That probably is the first thing that happens. Is like, yo, who are you? All right, anything else? That could be it. All right. So we now have a pretty well-defined game, actually. At least we have the bare bones of how the game should feel and how the game should play. So we know that we're trying to give the player the feeling of discovering something new, the fantasy of discovering something new. We know that we should give them freedom of movement, allow them to explore novel ecosystems, and encourage them to do prep work to get to those ecosystems. Our game actually plays by starting in an investigation phase, where we're in the ship preparing to go off on the adventure. Then we actually traverse to that next destination. And while in open space, we may face some problems like some asteroid fields or something like that. Then we land on the planet, we go straight to the head honcho. We talk to the president of this planet. And the president, while a little standoffish at first, eventually realizes that we're here to help and asks us to go off on a mission. We've got a pretty well-defined game now. So do we think that these three beats fulfill our player fantasy and our gameplay pillars? What do we think? Let's start with the player fantasy. So the player fantasy is the joy of discovering a new place. Do we think these 3 beats give you the joy of discovery of a new place? Anyone?
I might argue differently.
Yeah.
The way I envisioned it was that I go figure out a planet, discover it.
Yeah.
I kind of build it.
And you what?
I kind of build it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I pick no one to be on the planet.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So the argument is, well, it doesn't quite feel like I'm discovering a new place if there's already people there and I can't really like put my finger on it. So this might be a moment, this is another reason that player fantasies and gameplay pillars are awesome. This might be a moment where we go, actually we kind of missed the mark. And we go back to our beats and we edit them to better fulfill. We're not going to do that right now, but it's a good example. What about our gameplay pillars? Freedom of movement, novel ecosystems, and prep work. Do we feel like these 3 beats hit those pillars? Why not? I saw you say no, so now you have to answer.
We haven't really looked at the ecosystem at all. We haven't introduced that part.
I totally agree. There's no ecosystem. We said there'd be an ecosystem, and there's no ecosystem. Yes. So probably we should go back and iterate on this game before we actually start building. Okay. So that is your introduction to game design and how designers actually think about building a game. You probably notice that there's some similarities to what product designers do, but then there's also, of course, some differences in how we actually approach it in the game development space. I've got a couple of minutes for questions. Does anybody have questions?
Is there a set number of how many beat cards you can make?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the beat cards, for anything in design, there's a million different ways to actually approach it. So the beat cards may not actually be how I design a different kind of game. Beat cards are great for games that have heavy narrative, but think about a puzzle game. If it's like just a match 3 game or something, we probably don't need beat cards like I'm just doing a puzzle, right? So we use different tools for different circumstances, so there's no answer to how many beat cards there should be. The way that these beat cards would actually probably be used most is in what we call mission design or quest design, where we're designing a single little piece of gameplay. I'm going off on this quest and completing it, as opposed to using it for the entire game like we just did here. But I did it this way so that you guys can sort of see how our process works. So the short answer is there's no answer.
Hi, interesting talk by the way.
Yeah.
And so my query is related to the learning curve of a game designer and developer. I myself am designing a game on VR, so just some suggestions and insights on how do I proceed in learning all the design and development fundamentals.
Yeah, so this is, the first piece of advice is one that you all already know and you don't need to hear it, but I'll tell you anyway, which is go and seek the past masters. Find mentors. And when you're looking for mentors, you're looking for the very best you can find, and you're looking for people who are as close as possible doing what you want to do. So look for other VR designers and ask them, because they're going to be able to give you the best advice. That said, a fundamental of game design is iteration and user testing, which is also true of product design. No design survives contact with actual players. So start with your best guess and make that as fast as possible, make a little prototype, and then go and play it with a real human being and see what they do, and then iterate from there. Any other questions?
Thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
I had a couple of 2 questions basically connected. So first question is, I have been like developing games for a while, in personal time.
Yeah.
How do I sort of transition to the next level? Because I participate in some game jams and all, but it doesn't really feel like I'm making something as a project or something decent level.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, I wanted to delve into professional game development. How is the scene of game development? Because from what I have heard, it isn't really that good for professional game developers. Things get really bad,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's sort of 2 answers to this. For people who are working in games, it's an incredibly lucrative field. We make a ton of money. We're half the age of the film industry, and we're worth twice as much. So game developers make a lot of money. It's one of the most lucrative products on the planet. That said, partly because of that, and partly because we're a bunch of nerds just making games, and that sounds fun, it's also incredibly hard to break into game development. and it is a somewhat unreliable industry. You'll have super high churn, many layoffs, and you'll be switching jobs very frequently. I've had 4 jobs in the past 3 years. So it's sort of like a bit of a give and take. The stat that is sort of sad, but is good for everyone to know, is in a year of applying for a junior who has not had a professional job before, you have about an 8% chance of landing a job. So less than 1 in 10 land a job. As a result, what I recommend is that you do anything you possibly can that is entirely within your control, which mostly means you work on your own projects, you find other people who are as talented as you can possibly find, who are also interested in working on games, and you escalate the scope commitment every single time. So you start by making little baby games. Game jams are a great way to start. And then once you've done a couple of those, you make something a little bit bigger. You do a 2-week game. Then once you do a couple of those, you do something a little bit bigger. You do a 2-month game. And that way you're going to fail quickly, and you're going to get better and better and better, and you'll notice this, things to learn. And your games will get better and better. And every time you release a game, you're also taking a shot at the game design lottery. You never know. You might get super lucky, and you might be the next Lethal Company. The other thing I would say is something I already said, which is go find mentors. It's easy to reach out to the lead designer at Bethesda. They probably won't respond to you. Look for people who are just a couple of years ahead of you. Look for somebody who's just gotten started. They've got a year or 2 of professional experience. They're not going to tell you the groundbreaking answer that's going to change your whole life, but they will tell you the next steps. They'll tell you what you got to do next.
Thank you.
Of course. I've got time for probably 2 or 3 more.
Multiple games will evoke, certain type of emotions,
Yeah.
right? Certain games would make you, win levels, encourage you to play more. And there will be certain games which are very addictive in nature. When I say they're very habit forming, right? So I want to understand what is that exact equation, when it comes to game design, that a user also feels hooked, while playing game.
Yeah.
He feels motivated that, I want to play more. So when it comes to game design, what is that equation looks like? What emotion, from an emotional perspective, right, emotional angle perspective, what all ingredients does it really require, to make a very hooked game?
Yeah.
you can say?
So if I could give you the answer to that question, I would be a billionaire. In general, study basically psychology and motivational design or motivational thinking. The way that we get people to play games is the same way anybody gets anybody to do anything. There's various ways that we can hook humans into doing something. So for instance, there's a ton of gacha mechanics that are really effective. For instance, making a player wait for something makes them inherently more likely to stay around than giving it to them right away, which makes sense. If I have to wait for it, I'm not going to just leave and not get it. There's also a bunch of different frameworks out there. This one is really old, but I don't know, because I learned it a while ago, I've never forgotten it, so it's maybe a place for you to start at least. This is called the Octalysis framework. It's by a guy named Yu-Kai Chow, and it's actually a gamification framework, meaning it's not wasn't intended for game design. It's intended for, oh, that's not working at all. Well, you can look up Octalysis framework. You see how to spell it up there. And he has this theory that motivation is distilled down into 8 primary categories: accomplishment, meaning, empowerment, social influence, unpredictability, avoidance, scarcity, and ownership. So for instance, I get addicted to Minecraft because I have an extreme sense of ownership. This world is mine. And so his argument is that these different motivational frameworks is what compels somebody to play a game. But that said, like I said, there's so many different ways that people approach it. I mentioned that 90-10 rule. That's really a great place to start. So copy mechanics first and start to understand why they work as you work on them. So if this gacha game over there has this brilliant chest opening mechanic that people seem to love, just straight up put it in your game, and you'll start to understand it better by doing so. Yeah, probably 1 or 2 more. Any other questions?
Are you seeing a transition? So these days, a lot of other businesses, or rather, applications out there are trying to make gamified solutions, right?
Yeah.
So, are you as a game designer, do you see that as a scope? And how well can someone transition into mixing business with game and then achieve this?
Yeah, Facebook addiction is a medically recognized term, which is wild. And part of the reason that Facebook addiction is a thing is because of gamification. Gamification is not a question anymore. It is a fact. For a period of time, maybe a decade ago, gamification was like this hot new thing. Now it's just a thing that we do. Part of the reason that game design is so lucrative, game development is so lucrative, when you can break into it and when you win in the lottery, is because it's really good at getting players to do things. We've been playing games since the beginning of time. I recently bought the Royal Game of It's 5,000 years old. You can still buy it on Amazon, and the only reason that we know how to play it is because we found a clay tablet in ancient Babylon with the rules on it. And I played it with my dad recently, and it was an awesome game, and we couldn't put it down for a while. Games, like, fundamentally what they boil down to is, like I said, motivational frameworks. It's what compels us to even act. So the short answer is gamification is here, it's a thing, and it absolutely can apply to all kinds of things that aren't just game development.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe one last one? Yeah.
So when you design a game, are you compelled by the technology or device you're developing it for? Let's say I'm developing it for a PC. So do you kind of jot down whatever you design to work well with that device?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a book, a really good book for anyone who's trying to get into game design called Game Feel. And there's like 2 or 3 chapters in that book about hardware design. When I first read that book, I was like, why am I reading about hardware design? I'm a game designer. The hardware already exists. By the time I finished that book, I thought that the addition of that was brilliant. Because ultimately, the way that we play and the way that we feel and experience our games is dictated by every element of the game, including how it feels. There's a reason that rumble packs became a universal aspect of game controllers, because it sure feels good when the controller vibrates to something that happens in the game. So absolutely it matters which platforms we're releasing to, and we do definitely think about how the player actually experiences that thing. The best modern example is probably Nintendo products like the Nintendo Switch, where you can like pop out the Joy-Cons and do all kinds of crazy stuff with that, like play tennis or whatever. People think about it all the time, and there's a bunch of really interesting use cases. Something you might look up is GDC's Alt Control, which is design, it's a bunch of games basically made using alternative controllers. So people are making like games that require you to stand on a surfboard and that's how you play, or games that like make you blow through a straw and that's how you play the game. There's a bunch of really interesting ways, and yes, we definitely think about how the player actually experiences it kinetically while designing. Okay, that's gonna be it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Willem.
Yes.
For a wonderful talk. And, I understand that he was doing a workshop there, and immediately after the workshop, she came. So, really thankful to you and for this. And we have discussed that, we look at the future possibility doing some workshops and all. I'm sure it will be interesting. And, a small, this is basically we have printed here in this machine. Called PDM toxins.
Wow. Thank you. That's awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and you have a dinner commitment, yeah?
Yes.
So he'll be leaving.
I do have to leave,
can you just wait for 5 minutes? Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm sure we announced for the one talk today. But you're lucky that in place of one talk, we have 2 talk, okay? And come, Joseph and Shilpa, come forward, yeah. So we have Joseph King, who is the CEO of Wheeler Design, which is an Indian game design company. And we have been talking, but since he was very busy and he was not prepared for it, but finally today when I met him, so he agreed to give us a little informal discussion on product management and all. And Shilpa is a graduate from IIM Lucknow, yeah? and you are involved into game maker, yeah, with the content, yeah. So it's a very interesting content this thing where there is a focus section on product management, yeah, and Joseph is a graduate from University of California with major in electrical engineering and computer science, yeah? Yes. And also MBA in entertainment and finance from Anderson School of Management from UCLA. So over to you guys. Okay. And these are like a student of product design management and CS and ECE. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So I'll just take a listing.
Yeah. So. Yeah, so maybe I could, so I don't have any prepared remarks, but maybe what I could do is tell you a little bit about my background. And I think, Shilpa, you can get involved as well, but I think just to give you a little bit of a sense of my background, so I've been in gaming since about 2010. And so it started with like working on a game for the early social networks, so Facebook, MySpace, and that kind of allowed me to start making games there. I previously had a career in engineering, so I was an engineer, and I didn't know anything about business. And so when I first started my career, not knowing anything about business, I tried to start a company. It was very unsuccessful. In about 2010, I was at the exact right place, right time, very early days of mobile gaming. And if I had been the right person with the right kind of background, I could have been very successful. But I wasn't. I didn't have the skills. And so basically, over the last 10 years, I have been in gaming. I currently lead a game studio based out of Bangalore. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to actually build games from India. And I can go into reasons why we chose India and what we're doing, but we're working on an extraction mobile shooter in India, trying to work with the team here, but also bringing in leads from around the world. And this is something that I did formerly at a company called FunPlus, where kind of like 5 to 10 years ago, if you looked at the Chinese gaming market, China was not very dominant, and they were not dominant in mobile. And so one of the things that we did at FunPlus is we built a team from China, but for domains or disciplines that we didn't have a lot of expertise in, we brought experts from around the world to come to Beijing and to build games there. And I think that model is actually possible here in India, which is what we're trying to do.
You have not won the mic yet.
Okay. All right. Sure. So, flip this. Are you okay? Anything else? Any changes? This is fine? Check, check, check. Good. Okay, so I wanna, all right, okay. Okay. So I wanna actually make the best use of your time. And basically, I think that one of the things that I think is very important as you graduate and go into the workforce is that often you're going to be confronted with a bunch of nonsense. Whether it comes to process, whether it comes to the focus, whether it comes to how you work. This is something that you have to combat if you actually want to be successful in your career or be successful in the company that you work at, right? And we have somebody, Shilpa, who has been in the Indian gaming industry. You've got a guy like myself who's been working more globally, more in the West, but has worked with studios around the world, whether it's China or Germany or Canada or in many, many countries. And so I can provide the perspective of somebody who's been not from India, but is now building a studio in India. And maybe what I could do is if I could also just, again, to make the best use of your time, I'd love to hear about some of the topics that you guys are interested in, and then I'd be happy to spend, a few minutes talking about some of those things. So, for you guys, top of mind, in my understanding, you guys are engineers or you guys are interested in product management. Is that correct? Okay, so you guys are interested in market research. Anything else? Maybe we could get a few things first.
Risk management, like as the gaming industry is more about the wave. So if you miss the wave, then how you are going to mitigate it?
So risk management from the perspective of your career or
from the game development, like
from the game development. Okay. Yes. So market research, risk mitigation for a game product. Anything else?
Yeah, I think all are management level questions, but if you can throw some light, if you know if there are some homegrown fantasy game that is going to be built in India, because I see many people, they play all these games like God of War and everything which is from West, and India has a lot of storyline which can be built and converted into games. So do you see that as an upcoming thing in next few years?
Yeah, so great. Anything else?
Yeah, how do you find like different like people from different areas? So for example, let's say you're an engineer, right? Like you wouldn't have that much experience in designing.
I have an engineering background, but I'm actually more on the business side now. But, but go ahead, sorry.
At that point, you were an engineer, right? So you wouldn't have like art or like some stuff like that, right? So how do you bring together people from like these different like sources? Like how do you find them? Basically, how do you connect with them to come together and make a game? Because I am assuming like as a like coder or like engineer, you don't have much like a lot of freedom to design, right?
Right. Okay. Anything else? Are those the main topics you guys are interested in?
To build a successful game, what set of right balanced team that you would look at?
Right balanced team. Okay. All right. So maybe I could speak to some of these things, and and Shilpa, feel free to jump in at any time. And if I skip something or forget something, then just remind me, and I'll speak to them. But maybe the first thing I could talk about is this notion of team. So I think the kind of team that you're going to need really depends on the product that you're working on, right? And typically, for different kinds of games, like a lot of the games that are popular from India are very casual. Games like Ludo, cricket, board games. And so like the kind of game that you work on will determine the kind of team that you need to put together, right? And then I think it's very important when you start to work on a game is to understand what are the bases of competition. And what I mean by that is like when you think about a game, what is the most important thing that's going to allow you to be successful or not? Right now, we're working on an extraction shooter game, and it turns out that what's really important for us, because it's such a crowded market, and because there's so many products, and because shooters are 3D and have a lot of optimization problems, the kind of team that we need is great at game design and great at technical execution. So that's also a problem for us. Are you guys okay? Okay. And so like I would say like the team that you need depends on the product. Once you understand what's critical in terms of the execution of that product, that would help determine the kind of team that you need. And so for some games, like if you're working on a game that's like a content treadmill, right? Like let's say you're working on a match 3 game. What's really important there is the specific game design as well as how do you build content. King, for example, has invested a lot of money in like AI and tools for building levels so that you can have a very big content pipeline. But again, it would depend on the product that you're working on. And then in terms of like how do you find that team, I mean, I would say that there are a number of young folks that I meet who really talk about, oh, I'm about to graduate, I want to start my own studio. And then it's like, okay, so you are an engineer or you are a designer. You want to start a studio, you want to make this big game, but then who's going to work on the rest of it? And they're like, oh yeah, I haven't thought about that, right? And so depending on your situation, depending on the kind of game that you make, because certainly I think what's happening now is with AI and things like that, building games with a smaller team are going to become increasingly more possible. But for a shooter, you're going to need a huge tech team. You're going to need a huge art team. You're going to need a lot of different things. And so for that, I would highly recommend, one, starting to go to a lot of like game events where you can meet different people. So at Lila Games in Bangalore, we'll hold a quarterly what's called a Saturday school, where we'll have somebody give a talk and invite people from the games industry to come. And during those events, a lot of people from different companies, different disciplines will have an opportunity to meet one another. I would also say, though, that it's probably a good idea to potentially, depending on the game that you want to make, don't just start off like, I'm graduating, I'm going to start my own company. Maybe it would be better to join a company, whether it's like an EA or a Zynga or some other company, so that you can learn more about your specific craft and discipline, but also to be able to meet other people that you'd like to start a company with. And certainly when we see some of the companies that have launched in India, for example, Moonfrog, PlaySimple, and companies like that, those are examples of people that had worked at Zynga, left with a core team together, and then started that company together, right? There was another question about risk and also about market research. And I think the two are a little bit tied, right? Where when it comes to like building a game, I fundamentally believe that the proper approach to building a game is really about risk mitigation. And there was a paper that was published about 10, 15 years ago. It's called the Games Outcome Project. I would highly recommend all of you guys to look that up. What the Games Outcome Project did is it studied the outcomes of many, many game projects. And one of the things that, a couple of findings is that a lot of the games that had successful outcomes, one, had limited scope, but two, also had a heavy emphasis on risk mitigation. And so when you think about a production or pre-production process for a game, one of the things you should really think about is how do we have a proper pre-production? And that pre-production should naturally be aligned or have a major focus on how do you reduce risk. And the way that you reduce risk is through things like creating prototypes and seeing whether the prototype is fun or not, having that prototype be play tested by external folks, also just in terms of the concept, right? And so there are a number of companies, whether it's Split Metrics, we use a company called Geek Lab or others, where you can kind of mock up the game and you can have like a fake app store. And so you launch this game, you do user acquisition for this fake game just like you would for a real game, and you can actually see the metrics in terms of what it would take, how much would it cost to acquire a user for that game. And so in terms of mitigating risk, I think that to some degree is what new game development is all about. It's about how do we figure out if this vision that I have is a right vision, how do we mitigate the risk, and from the learnings that you have, how do you iterate from there? Does that make sense? And then there was a question about market research in terms of how you do it. I think that from a market research perspective, there's a lot of things that you could do to, for example, when you're first trying to decide what kind of game that you can make, you can actually at least characterize the market, right? And so there are data services like Data.ai, which is now Sensor Tower, AppMagic, many services where you can find data about the success of specific games in market, how well they're doing from downloads, monetization, as well as RPD, revenue per download perspective. And so you can use these data services to help characterize, okay, well, I'm trying to make a RPG game or a match 3 game or this kind of game. And you can find the other games in that specific genre and how well they're doing. I think the other thing that is, oh, yes, please.
For market research, a lot of people, would not have access to the data services because they are very expensive. For market research, a lot of you would not have access to data services because they are expensive, they are paid services. But time to time, these companies release reports that how the market looks like, how each genre look like, and if there is a big success in a genre, they again put reports. So what is important is you should read about these reports. You should look out for performance. You should proactively do that. If there is something which you really want to find out but you don't have access, you should reach out to somebody whom you think that can help you with just that data. They may not be able to give you let's say a screenshot or something, but they can give you an idea. They can have a talk. Like for example, if you want to know, if you are building a shooter game, you want to know that okay, how much Call of Duty Mobile is making.
you know that it is making in millions in a year, right? But the range, how is PUBG making, or Indus game which recently released from India, how much that is making? So most of the time, these companies, they themselves do PR. The data services, they also, publish reports or articles on that. So you'll get enough information. So never ever think that, oh, I don't have access to service, so I can't get every granular detail. But you don't need. Initially, at this stage, you will get enough data for whatever you require at, let's say, to a level higher, rather than, every granular data. So that's what I wanted to add. But please do read these reports. Do read the whatever interest you have in anything. Read papers on that. What is the innovation which is happening? Sometimes paper can get little bit high level, but do try to read them and try to understand them. Now we have tools like ChatGPT where you can feed the paper and say, teach it to me like I am 5-year fifth grader. So do that. Use your whatever tools are available.
Yeah, maybe the other thing I could do is talk in terms of speaking about market research is that it's actually a very, market research for games is a very big topic because there's so much that you can discuss about it. There's so much market research that can go wrong, right? And so, for example, I won't tell you guys the game, but I used to work at Sega, and one of the studios that was owned by Sega conducted market research for a game that they were developing. And so what they did is they went out to the market, and they're like, hey, do you guys like this kind of game? And they're like, yes. Do you like this kind of game? And they said, yes. Do you like this kind of game? And they said, yes. And so what wound up happening is they created this game that was like 3 different games in one, right? And so sometimes the way that market research is conducted can actually lead you down really bad paths, right? And so the way that you structure the test, what you test, is critically important. And it really does require art and skill and just I deeply believe that the more compact and cross-functional, the smaller that you can make the team, the less bureaucratic you can make the team, the better. And so I do believe that the better model in general is to have product managers that can not only do the analysis and have the thinking in terms of the business, the economics, and doing a lot of analysis in terms of the gameplay and things like that, but also can implement and execute and work directly with engineering. In my opinion, those are the best product managers, and that's the best kind of a structure when it comes to product management. But there's successful models in other ways, but I think you can go too far. So Ubisoft is a great example of a company that's gone too far in terms of specialization. And they are the absolute worst in the games industry when it comes to what's called like revenue or bookings per employee. They are the absolute worst at efficiency.
Related to the same thing, let's take 3 role in a game: design, development, which is a tech role, and then take business role, which is about producing or actually going to the market kind of thing. So what kind of people with the background, like business background, tech background, design background, which actually work much better as a product manager?
For a product manager, what kind of background?
Yeah, so which is, yeah.
Okay, so I think before I answer that question, I think I should explain to you, how many of you guys have read the book 0 to 1 from Peter Thiel? Okay, so one of the main concepts that's from that book is this notion of 0 to 1 and 1 to n. And that's kind of like from a games industry perspective, it's an important concept because when you look at the historical context of the Indian gaming market, what has happened in India is that the games market largely has not been 0 to 1. It's been games from Western markets like Zynga, San Francisco. There's a game declining. Oh, we got to manage for cost. Let's kick it over to India. It comes to India. And then in India, it's operated for lower cost. Now, the skills required, the kind of product manager required to take an existing game and just to live operate it is different from a product manager when you're trying to do 0 to 1, when you're trying to make a new game. And this is a very important distinction that's now becoming a little bit more popular. And I want to say I helped popularize this notion in the games industry, but like that fundamental understanding of these differences really confused a lot of people for a long time. And it's like, wait a minute, we took this live ops team from Zynga and we funded them to make a new game and they completely failed. And they didn't realize that the skills that are required for live operations and building a new game are very, very different. So to answer your question, I would say when it comes to 0 to 1, new game development, then I think that you can have different kinds of backgrounds. In my opinion, the wrong background would be to take a live services PM and try to make them a new games development PM. And so I've had better luck. I would, like at our company, I've interviewed a lot of people at Zynga. And I have reached the conclusion that it's better to hire somebody with no experience than somebody with 5 years of experience at Zynga doing live ops and try to get them to work on a new game. But the kind of skills that I'm looking for are really like critical thinking skills. And so when it comes to product management, what I think makes it for a great product manager is someone who has strong quantitative skills, who has strong critical thinking skills, and who has a very hard work ethic for new game development. And so like at our company, we have, let's see, 5 PMs. One is a former investment banker, doing great. We have 2 former engineers, and maybe we only have 4. And we have basically a very quantitative person, but she's a like fresher from IIT, but very smart. So a lot of logic questions, quantitative questions, math questions. She answers them very easily. So those are the kinds of PMs, at least at our company, building a new game that have been successful for us in India. Are those with like quantitative, strong critical thinking backgrounds, and those who, have a hard work ethic.
So maybe another question, like, is it important to be a gamer to become a good product manager, game product manager?
It depends. So at Zynga, I would say most of the product managers I know at Zynga rarely played games. They were like MBAs. They were like guys that felt they were too good to play the game. I think for new game development, that's a mistake. I even think for live ops, that's a mistake. I think that if you're a PM, you should know your product really well. I think you need to play games and need to understand the games at a very foundational first principles level. So from that perspective, I think you have to be able to play the games to understand it with extreme depth.
So in gaming also, product management is a fairly new role. Earlier, you would not have a product manager. You would have a designer who would do this kind of stuff. But with mobile, you need analytics because you have a lot of data coming in. So yeah, is it important for somebody to be a gamer? I was not a gamer before I joined, gaming, but you can be a good product manager for a live ops game from one to end, but you would not be a great product manager. Why? Because you don't know your product. And if you don't know your product, you can be decently well with, let's say, some analysis and everything, but you will not be a great product manager. And my definition of good and great is that good is you're not going to get fired because you are able to see some sort of mistake, or you could identify some pattern or something, or you could find out the cause of some drop or some analysis. But so that's why you would not be fired. But if you have to increase and improve the impact of whatever feature you are doing, you need to be a gamer. And when I say gamer, it doesn't mean that you would be playing 24/7 games. No, for your bread and butter, you would. If you are a great product manager, you cannot help not playing your product. So if it is the case that, oh, I don't like playing games, then it means you are in the wrong place.
Are there any other topics you guys want to hear about? Okay, please. Acquisition.
So let's say you launch a game, and there are several games which are similar to the same game, right? And the differential factor could be, the characters, could be, the difficulty level. So many different factors could be there. So when it comes to acquisition, acquiring when you launch a new game, right? What channel, what mindset, what strategies do you like to think about in terms of acquiring users?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it first comes down to thinking about who are the players, like who is your audience in terms of the kind of player, like who's that player persona, and why are they coming to play your game? So it could be that you think that players are coming into your game because they want to kill. They want to kill a bunch of people, or they may be coming for social because they want to meet other people, or they may be coming because they want to explore. So what is the, what is that latent manifestation or desire that these players are coming in for? And then based upon those themes, I would basically try to create a lot of creatives against those motivations to play your game. And from there, like the channels are pretty straightforward, right? So there's basically three buckets of user acquisition sources. So there's the SANs, which are the self-attributing networks. Google, Facebook, TikTok, those kind of guys. Instagram, those kind of guys. The second are the rewarded ad networks. So AppLovin, Unity, there's a bunch of companies there that do rewarded video ads. and the third are DSPs. And so I would say right now, the majority of the ad spend are going to the SANs and the rewarded video networks. I'm talking from a mobile perspective for right now. So I would probably then try to take those creatives and then use these ad networks and just see how you do. Now, the important thing when you're doing user acquisition, maybe, and this is maybe not a question you're asking, but I can go into depth if you're more interested in it, is really understanding from a free-to-play perspective how your players monetize over time. And so I mentioned this concept of ARPU, average revenue per user. What you want to do is, as you're doing user acquisition, you want to be able to chart what your ARPU curve looks like for your players. And that will tell you what your margins are going to be, how much you can spend on your players, right? And whether you have a game that continues to grow or that's going to flatten out in terms of